Hello and welcome to another episode of No Power Panel. Thanks so much for joining me again. I am solo for this episode, but that's okay. We have a couple of good interviews coming up on the channel, so that'll be fun. And thanks for joining me to go over some of the big news of the past week. It's certainly been a big week with lots happening both in Canada and the United States. So we're going to take a look at some of the big stories. But I thought that we would kind of touch on it in a thematic way this week because I've seen so many commentators and podcast hosts and YouTube people and people on TikTok and on Instagram and on all of the various platforms that we use and on the mainstream media as well, talking about how good it feels to be hopeful, to have things to be hopeful about. And that's certainly true. There are a lot of things that have happened in the last week in particular that give us reasons to hope. And I'm going to be touching on those right now. Let's take a look at just some of the things that people are talking about as why they are feeling hopeful. And then I want to touch on, not to necessarily rain on the parade, but a little bit, I feel like we need to question whether the parade should exist at all and what that does both to our motivation to continue the kind of work that we need to do to ensure the survival of a progressive left agenda for North America and for the world, and also whether the things that have actually happened are on the whole worthy of getting our hopes up about. Let's start though with the really purely thing that I think everyone who exists on the progressive left should be feeling hopeful about, the thing that should be making us feel good. And that is, of course, that less than a week ago, Zohran Mamdani was elected mayor of New York City. Let's take a brief listen to that moment when so much of this hope exploded onto the scene, and rightly so.
The sun may have set over our city this evening, but as Eugene Debs once said, I can see the dawn of a better day for humanity. For as long as we can remember, the working people of New York have been told by the wealthy and the well-connected that power does not belong in their hands. Fingers bruised from lifting boxes on the warehouse floor, palms calloused from delivery bike handlebars, knuckles scarred with kitchen burns. These are not hands that have been allowed to hold power. And yet, over the last 12 months, you have dared to reach for something greater. Tonight, against all odds, we have grasped it. The future is in our hands.
The future is in our hands. It's a great message from the mayor-elect, and it's one that kind of embodies what we're talking about today. The future being in our hands and the importance of that, the ability to shape that as we go forward. So let's talk about some of the other good points that people are bringing up as the reasons to have hope, in particular within the last week. Let's talk about the fact that in the Virginia gubernatorial election, the Democrat Abigail Spanberger won 57-42, a massive spread, bigger than what had been predicted. She was seen as the favorite going into election day. It was almost guaranteed that she was going to win, especially given the Doge work and the fact that so many federal government employees live in Virginia. It was seen as very much the Democrats to lose. But that kind of widespread significantly beats what Kamala beat Trump by in that state. It significantly beats what Democrats have traditionally performed in Virginia. If you're looking for what the current American public thinks about the fascist regime, then in Virginia, it shows that a massive majority of the electorate isn't interested, that they backed the Democrat in that race. We're going to come back to that race in a little bit as we talk about why there are also things that we need to be cautious about given these results. But for now, let's look at the fact that in terms of the straight up choice between fascism and not fascism, 57% of Virginia voters chose to go with not fascism. So that's a positive sign. And let's look at the fact that in the New Jersey gubernatorial election, 56% of voters to 43%, roughly, chose to back the Democrat and not the fascist Republican Party. I'm calling it the fascist Republican Party because let's be very frank about this. If you sign up to run as a Republican right now, you are at the very least saying that you are fine with running under a party's banner that is currently instituting a fascist regime at the federal level. Now, there can be arguments about whether some of these citywide and statewide Republicans are actually fascist, would implement the kind of fascist policies that Donald Trump is putting in place in their localities. But regardless, if you are willing to say that you are a Republican, then you are at the very least belonging to a party that is led by the current fascist regime. And you need to wear that label when you seek your office under that Republican Party banner. You don't get to take the positives, or at least what you think are the positives, of being identified with the Republican Party, being nominated by the Republican Party, and not the detractor things that you actually also have to legitimately be a part of. So that's that. Once again, there are things here that we need to be looking at seriously on the critical side as well. But just on that raw choice, the fact that so many voters went with the non-fascist Democrat is a positive sign, and it should be something that we are looking to for hope, especially given how close New Jersey has been trending in recent years. The last gubernatorial election there was decided by a tiny margin, and in 2024, the presidential election was Trump. It was one of the states that there was polling shown when Biden was still the candidate that Trump was actually going to win New Jersey. And it was only saved by that swap out happening. And even then, Kamala only won in New Jersey by a handful of points. It wasn't the kind of blowout that New Jersey traditionally would be seen as. So the fact that this is the result here does say some very strong and positive things. And lastly, in the States for now, let's look at the New York City mayoral election results, where Zohran Mamdani cleared the 50% hurdle that was seen as what he needed to win by to have the legitimacy that he needed to relentlessly pursue his agenda and be able to bully the Democratic establishment into actually backing his agenda. He is now the most powerful Democrat in New York. Both Kathy Hochul and her primary challenger, who's the incumbent lieutenant governor, are going to be strongly looking for Zohran's endorsement. They're going to commit to things that they need to commit to in order to get that endorsement, and Zohran is going to hold them accountable on that. He is going to be able to have the arguments that he needs to have based on this result to say that even if all of the rest of the candidates had dropped out and backed Cuomo, he still would have been the victor. And that puts him in a really powerful position. He's the first mayoral candidate since the 60s to crack 1 million votes in the general election. He is an incredibly powerful force now in the Democratic Party. And the Democrats who didn't support him, who barely supported him are going to have serious questions to answer, because it's hard to see how any Democrat can get elected in New York City at this point if they have Zohran Mamdani backing a primary challenger, which he explicitly was not willing to commit to not do. Richie Torres, look out. Hakeem Jeffries, look out. Chuck Schumer, Kristen Gillibrand, you need to back the policies that he ran on to be able to secure support in New York going forward, likely. That's the positive things in terms of the United States. Let's look at some Canadian news, because there's also, as we've been talking about the Canadian budget, there's been some interesting news with parliamentary maneuverings. And I have a slightly different take on this than a lot of people. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some Canadian parliamentary moves. Then we'll go back and talk about some of the negative stuff going on in the States, including some of those signs that we watched happen in those results, that I think we all need to wake up to where things still are, and why it's incredibly important that while hope is something that needs to be provided to be successful in politics, and certainly we need to keep in mind when there are reasons for hope, and that's why we've gone over some of those really good positive reasons in this episode. But we also need to be very real. We need to be very focused in order to ensure that this is not a situation where we are caught resting on our laurels, and then all of a sudden it's another 2008 to 2010 with a Tea Party sweep or a centrist Democrat sweep, which I think is the bigger danger in this scenario, because the left hasn't done what it needs to organize properly. So, last piece of American positive news before we move over to the Canadian side. Dick Cheney died. This is an evil man who is responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths. Do not let anyone try to redeem him for you. Do not let anyone, Democrat or Republican, talk about anything positive that he contributed to society without also, and first and foremost, mentioning the war crimes that he committed, that he belonged in The Hague over. He deserved to be in The Hague, and now is the time to be speaking up about that, because we need to be very serious about making sure that people pay for their international crimes. Dick Cheney was a war criminal. I'm glad he's dead. I do not have any sympathy for him. No, I'm sorry. He was a monster. Okay. Now let's move over to talk about the Canadian parliamentary games that are being played. So, last week in Canada, the budget was unveiled. There are positive things about the budget. They kept dental care funding, they kept pharmacare funding, they kept the Canada Child Benefit funding, they've kept a lot of the Trudeau social programs intact. That's all positive, that's all good, that's all important. They've also cut tens of thousands of public sector good paying, mostly union jobs. They have also committed to huge amounts of new spending in ways that are not going to be helpful for the environment, that are not going to be helpful for the immediate needs of Canadians. There are no new significant affordability measures. There are no immediate relief for working and struggling people. There is a lot of what you would call probably light austerity measures. The new spending, and there is a lot of new spending, the new spending that they do have is new spending that might have looked very welcome in a Stephen Harper budget. Mark Carney is governing like a progressive conservative. He's governing in a way that would have looked very comfortable to a Bill Davis, to a Brian Mulroney, to a Jim Flaherty in a lot of ways, who these are stalwarts in Canada's recent progressive conservative movement, to Joe Clark. Some of these people who didn't believe in hard right politics, but believed in fiscal conservatism. And while keeping his caucus happy by keeping some of the Trudeau social spending programs that so much of the caucus was initially elected proposing in place, he is doing what he can to shift the fiscal policy of the government to the center right. And that is very clearly the intention with this budget. And so as a result of that, traditionally progressive conservatives are making supportive noises about this budget. That's not an accident. And that shouldn't be comforting to progressives. It shouldn't be comforting to progressives that a liberal prime minister is being able to go to conservative politicians who were elected under the conservative banners of Stephen Harper, Andrew Scheer, Erin O'Toole, or Pierre Poilievre, and woo them to his side with his fiscal policies. That is a dangerous precedent to be setting. And it's something that, while we should be happy about the Conservatives losing seats, and let's be clear that what we're talking about here is that Chris D'Entremont, who is a now Liberal MP from Nova Scotia, was a Conservative MP, and has crossed the floor to join the Liberal Party. And Matt Genereux, who is an Edmonton Conservative MP, has announced that he is leaving caucus and resigning as a member of Parliament. So that is all very, very important information, because what it does is it tells us the way that conservative voters are embracing this liberal government. And I want to think back to the podcast last week when I had Tony McQuail, NDP leadership candidate, on. If you haven't checked out that podcast, please do so. It's a great interview with a great candidate. He deserves to be in this race. Give him whatever support you can to help him stay in the race. But the point that he made, because I asked him point blank if Mark Carney is a progressive, and he laughed and said no. And that needs to be echoed loud and clear. Mark Carney is not a progressive. He's not a leftist. He is not on the left of the political spectrum. He is a center-right liberal. And conservatives feel comfortable crossing the floor to the liberals when they have a center-right leader. We saw it with Paul Martin. We're seeing it now with Mark Carney. And it's important to keep that in mind, because they need to be checked in that way. Let's also talk about the principles of floor crossings, because I've seen this come up in the discourse. There's a conservative member of parliament who has been making this point that floor crossings are not legitimate. And there's been a lot of criticism of him from other people on the online left community in Canada. And I want to be very clear about something. Floor crossings aren't illegal. They aren't. They are constitutional under our electoral and parliamentary system in Canada. You are perfectly entitled, as an elected member of parliament, to join a different caucus, to leave your caucus and sit as an independent, to do any of those things. You have been elected by the people. And that's the argument that often gets placed by the side who has somebody floor walk to them when it happens. This is a legitimate thing. It happens all the time. We've seen the conservatives make that argument. We've seen the liberals make that argument, and it goes back and forth. And in principle, it's correct. In principle, you are elected as a candidate to be a member of parliament regardless of what party you sit in. But here's the thing. This is what a Canadian ballot looks like. Because so often you hear, well, it's the name of the candidate on the ballot. We don't elect parties. We don't elect a president. That's the argument that traditionally gets made in defense of the floor crossing when it happens. But this is what a Canadian ballot looks like. So you have a candidate's name and another candidate's name and another candidate's name and another one. And then you have the place where you put in your X or your check, or you fill it in, or you do however you want to identify that that's the person you're choosing to vote for. But on Canadian ballots, there is a second line. And on that second line here, you can see this one says independent. This one says political affiliation, because this is just a sample ballot on the Elections Canada website. But on that second line on the ballot is the party that that candidate is running under. So in point of fact, in Canadian elections, the party's name is on the ballot. It just fundamentally is. And so I personally have a problem when you can have someone just say, I put that party's name under mine on the ballot because I knew that it would help me win the election, and then afterwards I crossed the floor. By allowing the party's name to be on the ballot in this way, you are making it so that floor crossings are not something that should be happening. Because let's be clear about something else as well. In Canadian politics, whether we like it or not, we have become more and more a leader-centric system. There are people who get to know their local candidates, who do the research on each individual local person. But there are huge swaths of voters in our country who show up to the polling place on election day and just find the party that they want to support and check off that party. It's why we can argue for proportional representation, because people are comfortable voting for parties at this point because they've been doing it. Because at some point we decided it was worth putting that party's name on the ballot. But by doing that, you are telling people that that candidate is that party's candidate. And so fundamentally for me, because that is the way that our elections work, because that is the way our ballots are structured, floor crossings are immoral. They just are. You should not be allowed to misrepresent yourself to your voters. And so I have no problem understanding that sometimes somebody needs, for their own reasons, to no longer be affiliated with the party that they were once affiliated with. But when that happens, because their voters voted for them by checking their name on a ballot next to their party's name, they should have to go back to their voters and put that new affiliation, whether it's a new party or an independent, on the ballot with their name and see whether their voters will elect them with that new affiliation. I don't like arguing for needless elections, and I wish that the route that we could take would be to just remove all political parties' names from the ballot so that you had to vote for your local candidate in a first-past-the-post system of local constituencies like we currently have in Canada. That should be the way that it operates. But the reality is that political parties that decide this process through laws are never going to agree to having their names removed from the ballot. And so because of that, we end up in a situation where either sitting as a member of parliament after having misrepresented themselves on an official ballot to voters, or you pursue one of these other solutions. You can't have it both ways. You can't want fair and free elections and for voters' wishes to be represented and to run our campaigns in the way that they are being run right now, and to then argue in favor of floor crossings because it's technically constitutional. Getting off on technicalities isn't enough here when it comes to our democracy. And so because our ballot looks this way, and because we put our party's names on the ballots, in point of fact, people are voting for the parties as well as the candidate. They're putting a check mark next to their party's name. You have no way of knowing whether a voter is putting that check mark there based on the candidate's name or the party's name, as long as they are sharing that space. So, Chris D'Entremont, I challenge you, resign your seat, run in a by-election, ask your constituents if this is what they want you to do. And then if they re-elect you at that point, great. Phenomenal. Any other conservative MP, any other Bloc MP, any other NDP MP, Elizabeth May, if you are considering doing this same thing, you need to consider the fact that your voters saw your party's name on their ballot paper. It wasn't just your name there. And so because of that, you have an obligation to ask your constituents through an official, another balloted election if they are okay with you continuing to represent them under a new political affiliation. If you don't want this to be the case, then as legislators, please consider the possibility of removing the political parties' names from the ballot so that then we can say that we are just electing local representatives who then do have the right to actually walk across the floor. But when you're asking people to check your name based on the party that your name is standing with, you don't then get to make the argument to them that they didn't elect the party, they just elected you. So let's talk about some other areas in addition to that one where we have talked about hope, but that needs to be couched a little bit. And let's start with the obvious one, the big news of today. The government shutdown appears to be ending in the United States, the longest government shutdown in history. Now, on one hand, that is great news. Federal workers are going to get their pays. Supports that were not being delivered to people will be once again delivered to them. All of that is positive news. The not positive news is that the Democrats caved. They caved. They didn't get a single thing of value for this 40-day shutdown. And this is the point about government shutdowns that the Democrats have never understood. The people who get the blame for the shutdown are not the people who caused it, one way or the other, because it's always both sides that cause it. The people who get the blame for the shutdown are the people who, at the end of the day, didn't get anything for it. That is the issue. Now, the Senate Democrats who flipped and I'm going to name them all because they're traitors, they will say, well, we got to vote. We got to vote on continuing the healthcare subsidies. You got to vote in a chamber where you need 60 votes. You're 47 people, and you need 60 votes for that vote to pass. That vote is never going to pass. You got nothing. You got nothing of value, Catherine Cortez Masto. You got nothing worthwhile, Dick Durbin. You got less than nothing for 40 days of a shutdown, John Fetterman, Maggie Hassan, Tim Kaine, Angus King, Jackie Rosen, and Jean Shaheen. You got nothing. You caused the longest shutdown in American history and got nothing for it. And you are then going to get the blame of the American people. You are. Because you said this is a vital reason to shut down the government. This is worth forcing federal employees to go 40 days without pay. And what happened was, in the end, you caved. And so what the American people are going to hear is, oh, well, it actually wasn't that important. We could have caved a lot earlier because it wasn't that important to us in the first place. The Senate Republicans offered this same deal after like a week of the shutdown. Are you telling me that it was worth standing up then, but not now? Well, then it must not have been that important in the first place. That's how this is going to be thought of. And so instead of forcing the Republicans, instead of saying, I don't care what happens, we are not going to let you take health care away from millions of people. We are not going to let you raise the premiums of millions of men, women, and children. It will not happen. You have said, okay, as long as we get to vote on it, as long as you follow Robert's rules of order in properly defeating us. That's effectively what they have said. And I'm going to go through this list again, because if you live in Nevada, you need to support a primary challenge to Catherine Cortez Masto and Jackie Rosen. If you live in Illinois, you need to ensure that Dick Durbin is persona non grata when he finishes this term. If you live in Pennsylvania, you need to support a primary challenge against John Fetterman for a jaw-dropping number of reasons, this being one of them. If you live in New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan needs to be defeated. If you live in Virginia, Tim Kaine needs to be defeated. If you live in Maine, Angus King needs to be defeated. If you live in New Hampshire, Jean Shaheen also needs to be defeated. These are the people who have betrayed the values that they swore to uphold in taking their oaths of office. And in putting forward and agreeing to this legislative outcome, they have destroyed the hopes of so many Americans who believed that the Democrats were going to stand up for them. Let's go back to the results from last Tuesday's elections. Because in New York City, 41.6% of voters, 854,995 of current counted ballots, and there's 93% of the vote in. All of those people voted for Andrew Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo is a credibly accused sexual harasser, and he garnered that much support. He garnered that much support from people in the most large and diverse democratic city in the country. That's not a good thing. It's not a good thing that there are that many New Yorkers who were willing to vote for somebody with Andrew Cuomo's track record. In Virginia, more than 40% of people still voted Republican, and the Democratic candidate in Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, is a former CIA individual who went on record both in the leading up to and in the aftermath of the election trashing Zohran Mamdani. In New Jersey, Mikey Sherrill, the governor-elect there, is a corporate Democrat who is also a former military individual who votes in favor of the military-industrial complex having power, having continued power, and continued access to power. These are not people who are progressive reformers in the way of Zohran Mamdani. And so we need to be very careful allowing the Democratic establishment to lump these victories together. Because Abigail Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill would have looked very normal in a Ronald Reagan-led Republican Party. And so, like in Canada with these floor crossings, the more we allow progressives and liberals and those people to be infiltrated by the center-right, by the Dick Cheneys and the Liz Cheneys and the Chris D'Entremonts, the more we need to recognize that those centrist elements are not a part of the same movement for societal change that we need to be intensely looking at and launching and creating and driving forward on the progressive left, on the socialist left. And so big tents are important. Every party needs them to win elections. But we cannot allow the hope of this moment to drown out the forceful energy that we need going forward. And so the last thing I want to talk about in this episode is Miss Rachel. Because Miss Rachel has shown us how to do this. She was Glamour Magazine's Woman of the Year. Because she understands that you can appeal to the masses without diluting your message. And so in accepting that, she wore a dress that had art from the children of Gaza on it. And it was incredibly moving and incredibly motivating and incredibly emblematic of this moment now that we are in. Because while there is hope in so much of what we have talked about today, while there is hope in the fact that Miss Rachel won this award, there is also heartbreaking reality in the horrors still occurring in the world, in all of the work left to do. And so we need to be motivated. We need to be motivated by the possibility of success when we look to Zohran Mamdani. We need to be motivated equally by the tragedy of failure. And in that dress of Miss Rachel's, we see both. We see the hope of an amazing woman who's speaking out for the right causes, winning a rightly justified award. And we see the continued heartbreak of the children who are continuing to suffer. And in that, we see the need for both. So absolutely feel hopeful. But don't let that hope anesthetize you to the pain that still exists in the world, to the pain that is going to be felt by families who are going to have financial hardship and medical hardship because of the resolution of this government shutdown and the Democrats abandoning their needs. And do not let that pain stop you from feeling the hope that you need to feel motivated to get out of bed every morning and keep working towards the better future that we all need to enjoy. Please like, comment, subscribe. On a personal note, and I've saved this for the end of the episode, I have had some medical issues recently. I appreciate everyone's patience over the last couple of months while I've been dealing with that. I'm still dealing with it. It's okay. I'm not in any serious danger or anything, but I do still have serious medical stuff going on. And there's going to be times over the next little while that I'm going to be having to continue to take time away from work. If you can, if you are able to, I do have a Patreon. I'll put the link in the description. You can also get to the link from the homepage of the YouTube channel. If you're able to give anything, I have one tier. It's $5 a month. And this show does cost money to produce. It does take time. I would sincerely appreciate if you're in a position to be able to join the Patreon. Please consider giving me the cost of a cup of coffee once a month to help. That would honestly really help me in my life right now. So please, if you're in a position, I don't like having to say or do this, but that's where we are right now. And I'll continue to put out the great content I hope that you are enjoying. So once again, like, comment, subscribe, check out the Patreon. Thanks for coming and joining me for another episode of No Power Panel. Getting to do this for you all means a great deal to me. So I appreciate that. I appreciate your trust in listening to me. We passed 100 subscribers this week, so we're on our way. Thank you, everyone, and see you next time.